All right, let's take a look at what a fresh document looks like, and I'll just make a new one. Again, film and video for the document type, size is HDTV 1080p. All the defaults, I'm going to tell it OK. And for this example, I'm going to go ahead and clear out all of those guides. So just go up to View and Clear Guides. All right. Now, again, I'm going to demonstrate how to do this with a video timeline. So I'm just going to set it to Video Timeline, create Video Timeline in the Timeline window. And if you don't have that, just make sure that you have Timeline window available under Window, Timeline. So create Video Timeline. And if you accidentally did not create a video timeline, this bottom left button will allow you to convert between frame animation, which is the other option available, and video timeline. So just get it to video timeline. Now, your video timeline is going to correspond directly with your layers. And what do I mean by that? Notice that this says layer 0. It has like a little twirl, and I can twirl it open, and it has this little stopwatch with position, opacity, and style. Well, if I make another layer, now I have a layer 1 and a layer 0. And you'll notice that every layer I make, I will have another layer in the timeline, another track to play with. And if I rename these, like background, it will rename the track in the timeline as well, so that it will match. So anything that I name this to, name the layer, will correspond correctly with the timeline. So these are representative of what's going on. If you turn off the eyeball on one, it will vanish from your timeline. Let me go ahead. Well, it's still there, but you won't see it. Let me go ahead and throw these away. Let's get something in here so I can start demonstrating how things work and what all these are. So I'm just going to go back. Long ago, we went ahead and made that snail with a mask. And you'll remember from like week 2, I believe, we have a mask around a snail. I'm just going to create a background layer that's clear. Well, it's just an empty layer. Control-Alt-Shift-E. That will create a snail here that has just transparency. Since I don't really need the mask, I just need the snail. I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to tell it to duplicate layer. Since right now we're in the snail with mask layer or document, I'm going to move it over to untitled document. So duplicate layer, target it, untitled 1. I'll just call this snail. Tell it OK. All right. Don't need the snail with mask for anything anymore. Let's go ahead and close that. Here we have our snail layer, and sure enough, we have a snail layer. Hi, snail. Boo, doo, doo, doo. So we've got the big old snail. Now I need to shrink this down. But if you're going to be doing destructive edits like that, what's a good thing to do first? Convert it to a smart object. That way you can come back later. Control-T to transform. And I'm just going to constrain the proportion. That's the Shift key on most versions of Photoshop. Some it's flipped, so you don't have to hold down Shift. Now we've got the snail. Hello, snail. And the snail's ready to go. Doop, 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 doop. Now, what if we wanted to just make an animation, something fairly simple, of the snail coming all the way across? And that's it. That's all we want to do. Well, we'll need to investigate how these controls work down here. Notice we have audio track, and that's because you don't just have the option of exporting GIFs. If you take a look at the timeline down here, you also have the option of exporting video files for editing in programs like After Effects or Premiere. I'm just going to mute it by clicking that because these are just going to be standard images that we're animating. None of them will have sound, so it's we don't really need that. So if you recall on the last video when I was in the frame animation, I had to make a new frame, move the snail, make a new, or the dot in that case, make a new frame, move the object, make a new frame, move the object, make a new frame. I don't want to go through all that trouble. What I really want to do is just have the snail move across. But before I do any of that, I need to make sure that my document is set up correctly. And you're thinking, well, you just did that. You went ahead and you created a new size and all of that. Well, now we also have frame rate to worry about. Notice down here we have 29.97 FPS. That's frames per second. This is vitally important. It is obscenely difficult to change your frame rate after you have animated something. You must change your frame rate prior to animating anything, okay? Because if you try to do it later, you're going to have horrible results. Now, if you have your document with you, your printout of assignment 11, animating loops, you'll see that down at that first column at the bottom, it says that you need to set it to 12 to 24 frames per second. Now, for most of you, 12 is going to be exactly what you want. If you're doing something absurdly complicated and high resolution and everything, 24. But honestly, 12 is going to be your bread and butter for this assignment. Things are going to work really nicely on that. Now, why did I put that you can have up to 24 if I'm going to recommend 12? Well, if you've done this sort of thing before, or if you've had an After Effects class and you have a really solid idea of what you're doing, you may say 12. That's not enough frames for what I want to do. Well, that's fine then. You can go all the way up to 24. For the rest of us, 12 is going to cut it. So how do we set this? Well, if you double click on this, which would be the first thing everybody always does, it does not allow you to change the frame rate. At that point, a lot of people start looking around in the file menu for some way to set it. But what you want to do is within the timeline palette, on the right is a little flyout menu. And now this flyout menu has a lot of important options in it. If we go up to the top, we can see what we have. We have Go To. This allows us to jump to a specific time or go to the next frame or the last frame. If we weren't on the first frame, then we could go to the previous frame or the first frame. It allows us to set a start of your work area and the end of a work area. All right, so what's a work area? Well, the work area is this at the top. And this will, within the, oops, I clicked the wrong button. Sorry about that. Within the video timeline mode, your work area will automatically extend to as long as your longest frame. Now, that doesn't mean that it always contracts. Well, apparently in this version it does. So what you want to do is set your duration by setting your background to be as long as you want, and that will control the maximum amount of time that your final render will be. So that's your working area. It's also how much we'll preview when you play. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we've got that. And we've got a whole bunch of stuff, but before I get too distracted and forget to tell you, we still have to deal with that frame rate. So let's go ahead and set the frame rate. And that will be way down here, about the, what's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, fifth from the bottom, set timeline frame rate. Click on that. Right now it's the default of 29.97. That's for most television. I'm going to set it to 12. And you can also type in whatever you want, but I'm going to do 12. There we have it. Now we have 12 frames per second. So that's what that does. So make sure you set this to 12 frames per second. Let's go over the rest of these little flyout menu options. We have the Go To control where we're going to. We have an option called Split at Playhead. And what that will do is just split your, essentially, well, here, let me show you. See this clip, this little piece of scissors here? This should do the same thing. Let's go ahead and come up here and go Split at Playhead. And now I have two layers of snail and snail copy. And if I rearrange these, of course, my tracks will flip around as well. And you can see that the original snail now only goes up to the amount of time of wherever the playhead was. And then the new one continues from there. And if they were combined, that would be the length of both of them. That's what the Split at Playhead does. It cuts your layer in two on the timeline, creates a new layer, and then you will have half of it at the beginning or wherever you position it. The first bit before the playhead, the second bit after. Now down here, before we get too off track, is my zoom control. I'm just going to zoom in so we can see what we're doing. Ooh, there we go. That's a lot better. I don't want this snail copy. I'm going to throw it away. Now, here's something to keep in mind. Notice the snail is not as long on the timeline as the background. If I scroll the playhead past the snail, even though the eyeballs are on both layers, we only see the background. That's because the playhead is showing a time where there is no snail layer, only a background layer. However, our layers are always available to us, so we still have control over it. We just have to lengthen it on the timeline. Notice if I mouse over here, I can extend it because I have this little extension option. So I can go past everything and make it the same length. So I said that this icon here, notice it says split at playhead, does the exact same thing. So you might be asking yourself, why didn't it also cut the background? Well, the answer is we didn't have the background selected as well. Let me undo, Control Z. If I shift click, notice that both of these tracks are now selected. In addition, both the layers are selected. If I were to split a timeline at playhead, all of them will split. I'm going to undo that because I don't want that to happen right now. So that's what the split does. Let's keep going down the whole list here. We have the split at, here, let me click on just the snail so everything will be available to us. All right, so we have the split at playhead. We have an option to move and trim. We can move start to playhead. We can move end to playhead. We can trim start at playhead or trim end at playhead. All right, so the start and the end is a reference to this track right here. So if I click move start to playhead, whole thing shuffles over. I'm going to move that back and automatically my workspace will shrink back down. If I click on the flyout menu, you're getting the idea. You're going to have to use the flyout menu from time to time, and that is absolutely correct. I click on the flyout menu again. We have move and trim. I can move the end to the playhead, and notice it slides off screen. That does not mean the workspace will expand because the workspace can't expand past 0 towards the left. It can only expand forward in time. Let me slide this back. All right. We also have the ability to trim the start at playhead. Notice that it became shorter from the left. It trimmed it down. Undo that with Control Z. And so guess what trim at end of playhead does? Trim end at playhead will crop it down the other direction. Those are very useful controls when you're dealing with timing. So don't forget that you can trim either end using just your playhead, and that you can move your playhead exactly where you want using Go To. So if we say Go To time, I could be absurdly precise. Look at that. It bounced to exactly that. Now, what is that? Well, it's this. Notice I can scrub on here. This is your time code. You have frames at the far right, seconds, that's the next bit, minutes, and hours. And we're not going to be using hours. I should hopefully not. If you're using hours, something has gone terribly, terribly, terribly wrong for this very short assignment. In fact, go ahead and take a look at your handout. You'll see that it says way up at the top, there must be at least 12 frames with 3 obviously animated elements. So 12 frames, okay, here we go. That gets down to our timing. We have, as I bump into the microphone, if we have 12 frames per second and 12 frames, we have 1 second. It's just like a mile per hour problem. If you're going 60 miles per hour and you've gone for an hour, how many, all that stuff. So if you have 12 frames per second, and you have 24 frames, you have 2 seconds of stuff. And so the bare minimum of this is 1 second at 12 frames. In all likelihood, you're probably going to want 12 frames per second so you don't have to animate too terribly much, and probably no more than 3 seconds. 3 seconds is going to be quite a lot on a GIF. Like 2 seconds is probably pretty good for what you're doing. So for a lot of you, it's going to be 12 frames per second and 24 frames, and you'll be perfectly happy working in that without any additional weird problems. So heads up on that. So in this case, I'm going to adjust this to 24 frames per second. Now, how do I get everything to be that? Like for sure? Well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to move the playhead until it says 24 and on here. Oh, that's seconds. My apologies. I'm going to move the playhead so that I've got 2 seconds since there we go, at 12 frames per second. And I'm going to trim both of these down. So I'm going to shift click both of them. And I'm going to go up to the flyout menu. And I'm going to go to move and trim. And immediately remember, you can't do 2 at once. Oh no. So what do? Well, I can use the scissors tool right here. Boop. And cut them both up. So now I can get rid of these 2 copies. And voila. We're down to, and how did I get rid of those? I used shift and I clicked on both of them and then I pressed delete. That's all. Now I'm going to zoom in. Now we should have 24 frames. And we'll be able to move through those. Notice frame 0 is where we're starting here, and it ends over here at 1 second, which is 12 frames and 11 more frames. And since we started at 0, that makes sense. That means we've got 24 frames. Fantastic. Time to save. Control S, because I was saying that you're going to want to save multiple copies. I'm going to go ahead and call this 02, just so that we have more than one copy in case something goes wrong. Okay, so we have the move and trim. We have the ability to convert frames, make frames from clips, or convert to frame animation. We're not going to be doing that right now. Same thing as just pressing this button. Now the convert frames to clips, if I can get that back up, make frames from clips is a little bit different. We'll touch on that once we go over how some of the frame grouping goes for. Right now we don't have anything that would make sense to do. We'll deal with that in a bit. So we have work area, and we can set our start at playhead, set our end at playhead, and then we can extract our work area or lift our work area. So the first two of those makes absolute sense. Start at playhead or end at playhead's the same thing as just moving the start or end of our work area. And again, it's this part right over here to wherever our playhead, this little blue guy with the red line, to wherever that is. Okay, so for the lift work area, we'll need to adjust the work area a bit. Remember when we split our snail layer in half, we had right down this red line. What if you wanted a gap between the two splits? Well, you could just resize it, right? Or you could adjust your work area. Don't forget to put this back when you're done or you'll have render problems. Then go to the flyout menu, go to work area, and do lift work area. Now I have the snail selected, so it will only affect the snail. Work area, lift work area. Notice we now have the snail and a snail copy, just like we would have had on a split, but we have a gap. That's the size of the work area. Let me undo that. There we go. Okay. So the other option is under the work area, we have the extract work area. And this may not work quite as expected because it tends to rely on video groups and we haven't done those yet. Extract work area, well, it got close. It's supposed to pull it out and then it's supposed to bring the split, remove the gap exactly as it did. So that's excellent. And I believe it's supposed to create a new document with this sliced out part, but it looks like it skipped that. That is for one of two reasons. Either it doesn't behave that way anymore, which is possible, or because we weren't using video groups, it didn't go anywhere, which is also possible. We'll try again in a little bit once we've covered it. But the important bit is that with that, let me undo a couple of times. We can do the work area, extract and lift. Let's just do an extract. And we can resize multiple layers at once, like we were doing with the split and delete, but we can skip a step. So that's what's going on there. Okay, I'm going to resize the work area to be the correct size. Here we go. All right. After that, we could delete our timeline, which destroys everything. We don't want to do that. Be very careful with that one. Notice there were no alert dialogues. It simply destroyed all of my work. So that's a danger button right there. And if we keep going, we have the ability to add timeline comments. We don't need to put these in. This would be if you're working with multiple people, you can communicate what you were doing and why, what a group's for, why it was put in, all that stuff. We don't need that for this, but keep in mind that that's there in case you do larger projects later. You have the option to loop playback. All right, so yeah, we want that because if we loop the playback, when we press play, we'll go all the way around and then back to the beginning. Since we're going to be creating a loop, we probably want this behavior. So we'll go ahead and leave loop playback on. We also have allow frame skipping. So the allow frame skipping, that has to do with how Photoshop allows you to preview things. If we drag the playhead around a little bit or press play, you'll notice this green line, and right now it's solid because we've been working in this for a bit. This green line shows you what is currently being stored in your RAM, and it's very, very, very thin and hard to see. That's just the life of this thing. It's a little easier to tell when things are broken up. Let me just extend this out a bit. See how the green line stops? If we mouse over, see how the green line's extending? That green line, oops, as I break this off from where it should be, that green line just shows you what's in RAM for a RAM preview. In other words, it's how smoothly something will play back. Now, the allow frame skipping literally allows it to skip frames that aren't in RAM yet while it tries to load in other bits and pieces in the future. I don't like it very much. When you're working with GIFs, you could miss errors, so I just leave that off. If you're doing like full out video editing in Photoshop for some reason, as long as you don't have any audio, then that will be fine. If you try to do it with audio, you'll get some bizarre results. So that's all that allow frame skipping does. It tries to create a smoother playback by skipping what you're looking at. In our case, we're not going to use allow frame skipping because we don't want to allow frame skipping. Well, that's about half of the menu options, but we're at about the 20-minute mark. So I'm going to make this part 1 of 2 on the timeline controls. I'll see you in part 2.